I'm John Rees and welcome to In Conversation. No day passes without news headlines about the rise of the far right. US President Donald Trump, the standard bearer for populist right, commands hours of broadcast time and miles of newsprint on any given day. And Trump is by no means alone. Giorgia Meloni in Italy and Viktor Orban in Hungary are fellow heads of state. Marine Le Pen in France and Nigel Farage in the UK are seemingly knocking on the door of government. So how do we understand the new right? This new book, Creeping Fascism, and this is the new edition of it, has just been published, and it argues that we're seeing the onward march of a new form of fascism. Today I'm joined by Seema Syeda, who has contributed to the book. Welcome to the programme.
Jonathan.
Just tell me a little bit about where the book came from originally and what the new edition is about.
So this edition was actually published in 2019, and basically I and our late co-author Neil Faulkner, we were both watching Donald Trump's first presidency. We were watching Nigel Farage and the horrific racist, Islamophobic rhetoric around Brexit. And we were seeing that the rhetoric that we were hearing and the ambitions of these political leaders was symbolic of a process showing us that fascism was rising in the US and in the UK. But it was not only that, it was the international context. So if you look at India with Narendra Modi in 2014, when he was elected to be Prime Minister of India, Modi's history is a clearly fascist one with the RSS and the genocide in Gujarat. And these are facts which are things. This is a phenomenon that's happening all around the world, but which for us was ringing alarm bells at the time. But we seem to see that people around us perhaps were not sensing the urgency of this rise of fascism. So we published this book to try and show that actually fascism is a process. You don't necessarily have to have fascist paramilitaries marching in the streets, because actually what we were seeing were political leaders with fascist ideas and ideology able to be elected to parliaments and having ambitions to govern states. Now, the problem was that in the 1940s, there were also organised left and labour movement resistances to fascism on the streets. And at this moment in time, across Europe and around the world, that kind of resistance, we're not seeing it in the same way, which is quite a big worry when it comes to defending against fascism.
Okay, well, look, we'll come on to discuss that, vital question about the resistance in a bit. But just let me see if we can sort of delve a little bit more into the idea of creeping fascism, because I guess in most people's minds, kind of fascism doesn't creep. It's a sudden rupture in the political process. Akin to, if not always accompanied by, a coup of some description, a very sharp break in political development when a new kind of state emerges out of it. So the idea that it kind of creeps up on you is a little odd. Do you want to sort of explain that a bit?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. I think even if you look in history at the 1940s, there was evidence of a creeping fascism at that time in terms of the way that the media in Germany and across Europe started demonizing Jewish people in Germany. So in that sense, the ideological discourse where there's an outgroup that is defined by the fascists that is then targeted and demonized, I think is something we have seen in Europe as well, specifically targeting racialized people and Muslims especially. But in terms of this idea of coups, especially military coups or armed coups, we have to also remember that Hitler was elected to the Bundestag first. And now when it comes to Trump, in his first election, he was also elected. He wasn't necessarily using overtly violent rhetoric, but in between we did see that there was a coup attempt on Washington, which failed. And now he's in power. He has taken over parts of the state and used the army, created ICE, which is almost like a paramilitary that's kidnapping people off the streets. And I think he is trying to create this kind of violent attack on liberal democracy. And Elon Musk as well, he was video conferenced into the Unite the Kingdom rally in the UK, where he said violence is coming to you and people should be ready to fight or die. So I think what we are actually seeing now is a move away almost from this kind of creeping fascism where it's more about ideology and discourse and politicians saying that they want to be elected to the parliaments and they're not really racist, to these new outright colonial discourses that are unashamed almost. Trump is almost like the mask falling off of liberal empire to a proud colonialism that he bandies around without shame.
I mean, I get the bit about the sort of ideology and how close a lot of what they say is to some more, historically precise kind of ideas of fascism. But some people might say with Trump, look, you guys said this in the first term. He lost an election. All right, there was the attempt on the Capitol. How serious he was about that, didn't really involve any armed forces. We can debate about that. But now he's got a second term. Some people are saying he might try and sustain himself in power, but that looks at this stage like a bit of a reach. So, all right, he's an authoritarian, he's a racist, for sure. But actually, he's pushed at the limits of liberal democracy, but he's still within them.
I think that is a really important and interesting argument, which I do actually have time for, especially, I think, seeing what's happening in Gaza over the past few years and the genocide. And me, myself, since co-authoring this book, I've spent some time living in France, in Marseille, and I've spoken to a lot of Algerians, and I've read a lot more about Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, who were saying that actually the will to empire, which is inbuilt within liberalism, is actually where fascism real shoots and spring is. And for instance, Fanon, if those listening don't know, he was born within French Empire and he saw himself as a citizen of the Republic, and he went to North Africa to fight the fascists as part of the resistance. But then on Liberation Day, he wasn't allowed to attend the parade because he was black. And that's when he realized that actually Europe and its liberalism is not what it says it is, and he joined the resistance in Algeria to French colonialism. So I think this idea actually, I guess I'm nuancing it more. I'm not actually saying that Trump is not a fascist because he's an authoritarian within the bounds of liberal democracy. What I'm saying is actually liberal democracy has the seeds of fascism in it. And, Biden was just as complicit in the genocide as Trump was. Keir Starmer has sent 3 times more weapons to Israel than the Tories did. And so what we're seeing actually is, yes, fascism is something that has never really gone away and is almost inbuilt in parts of liberal democracy and society.
And what about the relationship between sort of traditional fascism and violent paramilitary organisation? Famously the brown shirts in the case of Hitler, but also the fascist bands in Mussolini's movement. There is, to take this country, there is an electoral far-right challenge in Farage. There is a bunch of street thugs. I mean, certainly not a disciplined paramilitary organisation. I think we can agree, but they exist, and they are attacking the left, and they are attacking the Palestinian movement, and they're attacking migrant and immigrant communities, but they aren't quite, Tommy Robinson isn't the armed wing of Nigel Farage. I mean, you might make that as a kind of metaphor, but they're not actually organisationally linked in the way that the brown shirts were. So do you think that we're seeing a sort of a situation where the elements of traditional fascism are emerging, but they haven't actually quite coalesced yet?
I think that is quite possible as an analysis, actually, because you are correct to say that they're not united organisationally. Farage portrays himself as a respectable politician, the same way that Marine Le Pen does in France, and he, tries to say, oh, these thugs on the streets, they're nothing to do with us. But in fact, they do work in tandem to create an acceleration of the far right in Europe. I just want to go to India for a second, because India does have an organised paramilitary fascism on the streets that is organisationally tied to the BJP, which is the RSS. And it is interesting to see the way those global dynamics are playing out in the UK too, because we are seeing some aspects of RSS mobilisation here in the UK amongst elements of the Indian diaspora community, which flared up in Leicester as well. And we're seeing that the UK far right, like Tommy Robinson, is trying to make some kind of links between these communities too, to try and say, we're here united against the danger that is Islam. So I think you are right to say that actually they haven't coalesced into this organised fascist paramilitary movement that's very disciplined yet. But what I would say is I think the reason perhaps why we were making this argument about creeping fascism is we don't want to wait for them to get to that stage before we sound the alarm that this is what is happening. And I guess that's where the creeping comes in. I know lots of people who say, oh no, surely the kind of fascism we've seen in the 40s could never happen here. Britain is one of the most liberal places and multicultural places in Europe. Someone said that to me the other day. And I think that's where the danger is actually it could happen. And I think that's why we need to start organising actually on the ground in ways that the community can actually defend itself so that these fascistic elements like Tommy Robinson can't actually coalesce into an organised movement. And the thing is, they are doing these protests outside the asylum hotels, you know, more like riots, or some people say pogroms, and this is their attempt to start creating nationwide violence and fomenting that. And we're seeing a Labour government that is capitulating to all of that, and I think also enabling the rise of the far right by copying Nigel Farage's rhetoric. So yeah,
certainly we'll come on to that in a moment. But when you were looking at things internationally, I'd be interested to know what you think other sort of proto-fascist movements, if we could put it like that, are they at that stage of development? I mean, the British situation, you know, as we were just describing it, you've got a very, looks like going to be depressingly successful electoral operation around Farage, and then you've got Tommy Robinson, more directly frightening in the sense that, you know, it was I think the first time that I can remember in post-war British history where a demonstration of fascists actually surrounded a left-wing counter-demonstration. In other countries, have you got that? Well, we know that there are the electoral formations, but are there correlates of Tommy Robinson's type of street mobilisation? And in other countries, if there are, how are they relating to the electoral formations?
I know this isn't directly answering the question, but I think when we talk about global fascism, I don't think we can avoid talking about Israel and Palestine and what's happening there. And I do think that's probably one of the clearest examples of a fascist ethno-state in terms of the IDF itself is an organised military army that's committing genocide, settler colonial and fascistic. And I do think they have had a role to play in helping to boost other fascist movements, especially in the UK, when we see Netanyahu immediately inviting Tommy Robinson to Israel and that happening. But in terms of other places, I think Latin America is quite interesting. I would say actually there are there is some hopeful stuff coming from Latin America. For instance, if we look at Brazil, they've just put Bolsonaro in prison. Bolsonaro attempted a coup, but you know, I think Trump is using everything that he can in terms of both trade war and the threat of actual war, as well as what you could describe an ongoing soft war, to try and close down and attack even the small spots of leftist governments. So I think there is a fight on our hands, and I think the answer probably is to be transnational as much as it is to mobilise locally, in that these forces are motivated by capital. They are funded by capitalists and billionaires, and therefore if we want our power to emerge as strongly as it can in resistance, we must also unite across borders. And I think ethno-nationalism especially is one of the big blocks to this. And if we want to go deep into colonial history, so many of the borders around the globe were literally created by Winston Churchill, especially on the Indian subcontinent as well. And this idea actually that our primary identity is the national one is one that we need to overcome. And I think that ideological battle is actually important as well.
And in terms of the sort of arc of development here, in terms of fascism, I guess this is a kind of how quickly or how slowly is it creeping question, because, like I say, we're in the second term of Trump. So the first term didn't didn't creep so fast that it arrived at a kind of formed fascist sort of experience. Thank God, but it didn't. Marine Le Pen's been and before Marine Le Pen, her father has been leading the far right for a long time in France, and they still aren't there yet, and may not get there. Viktor Orban's been in power multiple times in Hungary. So, what's your sense about the speed of the creep, I suppose, is the question.
I would say, I think the second term in the US, we have seen quite an acceleration in terms of Trump's use of ICE. I think there is this question mark around whether he would leave office, who would replace him if it's Democrats who are going to continue a genocide. I think that's really opened up people's ideological boundaries about the kind of world we live in. But in terms of the speed of this creep, I think the use of social media as a communication model that bypasses the liberal bourgeois media has been really critical to this acceleration, especially, for instance, the Unite the Kingdom rally. Many people said they didn't see anything about it anywhere. So there was clearly, and this is why owning X was so important to Elon Musk. This is why Larry Ellison has bought part of TikTok, because they can now use these platforms as models of dissemination for ideologies that they wouldn't be able to spread as easily in mainstream models. I mean, that's where this kind of respectable far right comes in, which is what Nigel Farage does. So there's been research showing that the far right are using Telegram to organise. People have made cells in different parts of the country, and they're saying things like, you should only have 10 people in each one of your groups, and you should get ready to arm yourself because there's a race war coming. And I don't want to alarm people because obviously that's not the goal and it doesn't help. But we should. There's the philosopher called Gramsci who says pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, and what could happen is pretty bad, and we need to prepare for that, but we should also feel optimistic that we can actually defeat it. And I do think it is still possible. We do have this window where we can defeat the rise of fascism, because I guess what one would say is that we know fascism is here when the space for us to resist becomes a space where there is only violence, the violence of the state and the direct physical violence. And right now, there is still space for civil society to act, for people to mobilise en masse. But we are seeing that a Labour government is shutting down those channels. And that's where creeping fascism is relevant, because lots of people would say Labour is not fascist. Yet they're implementing all the tools which will then enable an overtly fascist government or an overtly far-right government to lock down civil society, to implement those kind of things. And Trump is building on Biden. The anti-terror laws that are being used are building on Blair. So this is a time where I think the optimism can remain in that there's still a space to organise, to resist. The fact that I can sit here and talk about this is that evidence, and I think now we just need to get serious, and we need to start building the power base in our communities so that the state can't enact its authoritarian will on the people.
And to what degree do you think that Trump is a kind of international accelerant here? Because, I mean, it's obviously the case that things that Trump says today in America get said by the far right internationally tomorrow or the day after. But in the second term, it seems to be a bit more than that, in the sense that there seems to be, as you said, from Elon Musk, not just, colonising, to use a phrase, the sort of Twitter sphere, but directly, financially and organisationally intervening in support for the Tommy Robinson movement, for instance.
Well, that's been really, really critical. A lot of the funding also for Tommy Robinson, there's been research done into this. It comes from Robert Shillman, who is a US tech billionaire as well. So it's not just Trump himself, it's who Trump represents, which is the US tech billionaire oligarchy as well. And yes, huge amounts of funding have been channeled to Tommy Robinson. Even The Guardian, which at the moment is quite, let's say, not very sharp in terms of criticising those who need to be criticised, published an article a while back investigating Tommy Robinson's funding sources and revealed that there was a Christian Zionist think tank in the US that was funding Tommy Robinson. And even the Times of Israel republished this and said, why are these Zionist think tanks funding a fascist? So I think when it comes to Trump as an accelerant, I think the direct funding of the billionaire oligarchy who support him, that's one. And Trump, I think, is a tool of that billionaire oligarchy. He's not the agent. But there's also the use of trade war to actually really damage the global South's ability to stand up economically to American hegemony. And then that's also used as a tool to monopolize the markets in favor of US big tech. So X, Google, Meta, Lula's Supreme Court in Brazil challenged them, called them to come and give testimony. Why were they manipulating and spreading disinformation to influence elections? And Trump is enacting revenge for that.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I just want to ask you before we have to finish. There's a lot of enormous experience internationally of successful anti-fascism and some successful anti-fascism in this country. Cable Street against Oswald Mosley in the 1930s, the Battle of Lewisham, the defeat of the NF and then the BNP in this country. When you look back, just briefly, what do you think is the single most important experience that anti-fascists today can draw on from the past?
I think we need to look at anti-colonial resistance movements all around the world. And I think Algeria is a really good example where you had the French state, which was enacting brutal colonization of the population, and you had a resistance that was ready to come out and actually defend itself. And this is something that's a right enshrined in international law against a colonial occupier. And I think that experience is quite similar actually to what people experience in Europe under fascism, and actually building unity around resistance is important. But the key thing, I think, is not to limit that to a national resistance, which is what many anti-colonial movements did, and therefore then ended up actually instituting imperial modes of organising themselves through national borders, which allowed them to continue to be exploited. We can't do that. We need to think transnationally. How can we build global resistance and see ourselves as part of a global movement against the rise of the far right?
Okay, well, Seema Syeda and the second edition of this book, Creeping Fascism. Thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank
but
you.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So from In Conversation, good evening.